Without you, nothing would happen. So, our gift to you for your generosity tonight is to bring you Larry Reed. Now, Larry Reed, I have known for some time, and I'm going to read pieces of his bio so you have a good understanding of who he is. And he has had a vast array of experiences, and I just found out in talking to him tonight, he's been to even more countries than I had. So when I get to that piece, I'm going to change the number from 78 to 81. So since 2008, Larry Reed has been the president of the Foundation for Economic Education, headquartered in Irvington, New York. Prior to his current leadership position, he served as president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Michigan for its first 2 decades. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's degree in history. He has taught economics at Michigan's Northwood University, where he also chaired the Department of Economics for 2 years and founded the university's annual, highly acclaimed Freedom Seminar. He also served as president and member of the board of directors on the State Policy Network, a national organization of free market think tanks. Over the past 20 years, he has authored more than 1,000 newspaper columns and articles, dozens of articles in magazines and journals in the U.S. and abroad, as well as 5 books, with his most recent being called Striking the Root, Essays on Liberty. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, USA Today, and more. Since 1978, he has delivered more than 1,000 speeches in 40 states and 15 foreign countries, including China. Since 1985, Larry Reed has also visited 81 countries on 6 continents as a freelance journalist, including such intriguing places as Kenya, Russia, Cambodia, Haiti, Japan, Greece, Australia, Chile, Egypt, and Iceland. He has traveled with the Polish anti-communist underground, for which he was arrested and detained by border police. And on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, Congressman Ron Paul called Larry Reed one of America's leading advocates for liberty, and remarked that his writings reflect his unswerving commitment to limited government and the free market as the best way to promote human happiness. Well, I've known Larry Reed for a little while, and I'm very pleased that he is here with us tonight. He is known by the free market think tanks as someone of high integrity and someone who is generous with himself for the cause of freedom. His assistance has helped to hatch and help many of the nation's free market organizations. Out of his wealth of experience, Larry will talk to us tonight about the power of the individual. He has traveled the world to visit with the heroes of freedom. In some cases, freedom is just a spark of hope in the heart of a few. He has seen what just one person can do to turn that spark into a burning fire for freedom. He has seen what just one person can do to change the course of history for freedom, and he's here to tell you about it. Please join me in welcoming Larry Reed.
Thank you, Twyla. That was a wonderful introduction. I appreciate it very much. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And before I say another word, I want you to know how proud I am to have known Twyla and the work of your organization now for the better part of, a decade and a half or more. And although Twyla is from one state, she has a national reputation in all 50. And is someone that we often turn to for advice and policy counsel on healthcare issues. She wears many hats. She is an advisor, she is a policy crafter, and she's a kind of whistleblower, wouldn't you say? She's one of those people who you can hardly imagine ever doing without. Somebody who's out there sometimes alone saying, hey, wait a minute, that won't work. Or, hey, here's a better way to do it, haven't you thought of that? Or, hey, don't forget all the consequences of what you propose to do, because some of the unintended consequences may be so negative as to overwhelm whatever the positive ones may be. Which leads me to my opening unintended consequences joke. And it's about a lady who had a pet parrot. And this parrot had a very annoying habit. It would frequently say, especially whenever visitors came to the house, it would start saying, say fellas, I'm a swinger. I've actually sanitized it for you. It was a little you can fill in the blank. But anyway, this parrot said this over and over again. And it got to be rather annoying to the woman, so she decided to talk to her priest about this. And her priest said, well, this is no trouble at all. I have 2 parrots of my own, and they are the most pious, the most religious birds you'll ever meet. They say their prayers, they say the rosary, they have their beads. If you leave your parrot with my 2, mine will straighten her out. And so she did, and sure enough, within the hour, her parrot chimed in and said, say, fellas, I'm a swinger. Whereupon one of the other parrots turned to the next one and said, put your beads away, Charlie, our prayers have been answered. Unintended consequences. Well, I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight and quite honored. And I want to talk to you about the power of the individual, the power of one. And I often do this in the context of an issue that I think is the most compelling in our country, and that is a very serious erosion of character. That isn't specifically my topic tonight, but you can view what I'm about to tell you as a sub-issue, because I want to focus on at least 3 people, if time permits, maybe a 4th, that I think underscore what strong personal character and individual initiative can accomplish. But again, when it comes to character, I just want to plant a seed and say that I think that's the #1 issue that our country faces. I know that we all get caught up in the headline-grabbing issues of the day, the massive, out-of-control spending in Washington, and deficits and debt, and the looming Obamacare, unless we get rid of it, and those kinds of things. They're all important issues. But something that's even more important, that those things themselves are symptoms of, is this erosion of character. You get things like out-of-control spending and deficits and debt and centralization of healthcare in the hands of politicians. You get that if first, as a people, we've allowed our standards of character to slip. Things like honesty and humility and patience and courage and responsibility and self-reliance. When those things fall by the wayside, then you get the kinds of things that we're all complaining about at the national level. And until you fix the character problem, which I don't think any law of government or mandate from government is going to fix, it has to come from the home and from the heart. Unless you fix those character problems, we're not going to fix the other ones. So maybe that's a sub-issue tonight as we discuss 3 people, possibly a 4th, if our time permits, who did exemplify some very important traits of character. And all of them, and each of them separately, are certainly testimonies to what one single person can accomplish if he puts his or her mind to it and doesn't give up. 2 of the 3 people I'll start with are from the pages of history, and I never met them. They've been gone for quite a while. The 3rd one I'll talk about is still living and just turned 103 on the 19th of May. And that'll simply underscore the remarkable things that he accomplished, but he'll be number 3. The first one is a man who, my guess is, few people here will recognize the name. How many know the name Thomas Clarkson? Anybody know who that was? How many of you saw the movie that came out 7, 8 years ago, Amazing Grace? Okay, well, you remember that movie, and I encourage all of you to see it. If you haven't, you will love it. That movie focuses primarily on William Wilberforce, who led the effort in Parliament over 200 years ago to end first the slave trade and then slavery itself throughout the jurisdiction of the British Empire. But his right-hand man was this man named Thomas Clarkson. He figures prominently into the movie, but I think he's not given as much credit as he deserves. Even Wilberforce has said what they accomplished in the anti-slavery movement could not have happened had it not been for the good work of his right-hand man, Thomas Clarkson. So I want to tell you about him. It really is a remarkable story. I've written this up, by the way, in a little essay whose title tells you a lot. A student's essay that changed the world. Young Thomas Clarkson in the 1780s was a student at Cambridge University in Britain, planning to become an Anglican minister. But an event on the high seas would change his life. But more importantly, his reaction to it would change the conscience of a nation and the course of history. I love to tell the students who come to our summer seminars about this guy. So the message is, hey, you may be just a student, but so was Thomas Clarkson, and look what he did. The incident involved a slave ship in the early 1780s by the name of the Zong, Z-O-N-G. It was making this long journey from the port of either Bristol or Portsmouth, I can't recall which, in Britain, along the coast of Africa, rounding up slaves, and then on from there across the so-called Middle Passage, the Atlantic Ocean, to slave plantations in places like Grenada, Jamaica. But along the way, something happened that would change history. It wasn't all that uncommon, but because the story got out and the way it got out would lead to huge changes in the history of the world. The Zong had an especially long voyage. It couldn't make just one or two stops to pack the ship with slaves. It had various difficulties for various reasons. It ended up over several months having to make many stops until it packed the ship with more than 400 human beings against their will, in chains, bound for slavery in the West Indies. But that very long voyage meant that those who were on the ship the longest, who were rounded up at first, were most subject to disease and all the hazards of such a long and perilous journey under horrific conditions. Not far from the West Indies, the slave ship captain made a cold and cruel calculation. He observed that a good portion of the people in chains on his ship, bound for slavery, were in terrible shape, emaciated, disease-ridden, lost a lot of weight. He figured they're not going to command much at auction in Grenada or Jamaica. He decided then that he could make more money if he got rid of them and put in an insurance claim, that an act of God required that some of the cargo be thrown overboard. He gave the order to throw 132 living souls into the sea. Some of the crew members, and again, this was not all that uncommon. It had happened before, but some of the crew members were so moved by this, so horrified that they talked when the ship got back to Britain. And it led to a young lawyer in London by the name of Granville Sharp deciding he was going to do something about this. He was going to file murder charges against the slave ship captain. There was a trial. But in the end, the judge in the case simply dismissed it. And he said in his dismissal that this act was nothing more than like throwing horses overboard. Those are his words. And that this was nothing more than a civil dispute between a slave ship captain and an insurance company. Well, there was a professor at Cambridge who was in charge of the annual essay contest that Cambridge students could enter as long as they wrote their essays in Latin. And he determined every year what the topic would be. And there was a very coveted prize involved, and students really flocked to try to enter and win that contest. He was so moved by this judge's dismissal of the case that he decided to make, this was about 1782-83, to make the annual topic that year slavery. And specifically, the question was resolved that it is immoral for one man to own another. Young Thomas Clarkson, studying to be an Anglican minister at Cambridge, decided to enter the contest. He knew nothing about slavery. In fact, to the extent he knew anything, it was probably what most people in Britain thought, namely that, well, it's pretty lucrative business for some, and the ports are flourishing because of it, and it's not in existence here in Britain that we can see. It's somewhere else, and the slave ship people tell us that the folks are reasonably cared for. That's probably what he heard, because that was commonplace at that time. Slavery was widely accepted, not just in Britain, but all over the world. It had been in practice for hundreds of years. Lots of people were making money off of it. And so Clarkson decides he's going to enter this contest, and he's not going to just write something rhetorically from the seat of his pants. He's actually a very diligent student. He's going to do his homework. He goes down to Bristol to look for slave ship crew members who might be willing to talk. He gathers evidence wherever he can find it. And he writes an essay, which turns out to win first prize, in which he argues that slavery is a cruel and inhuman institution, a stain on the British conscience, and must be abolished. Not long after winning first prize, he's on horseback, riding from London to his village of Wisbech, agonizing over all that he learned in the process of writing and researching for this essay. And something happens that on a particular spot on that road that is marked to this day. There's an obelisk that marks where what I'm about to tell you actually happened. There was a point where he was in such anguish that he had to get off of his horse. He fell to his knees. And later he writes in his diary, "It was at that moment on my knees that I said to myself, if what I have written is true, someone must see these calamities to an end." What happens then is this man in his early 20s devotes the next 61 years of his life, the rest of his life, first to work against the slave trade, and then to work in favor of abolishing slavery itself. He lives for 13 more years after that, dies at the age of 86. And in those last 13 years, after he had achieved the pinnacle of his objectives, the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire, what does he do? In his late 70s and into his 80s, he devotes those last 13 years to helping improve the lot of those who had been enslaved. But it's a fascinating story how we get to that point, and I want to fill in some of those details for you. When Thomas Clarkson won that essay contest, there weren't many people in Britain who thought like he did. In fact, he looked around trying to find, who are my allies? Who can I organize to try to bring this message to the rest of the people, to enlighten them, which is what you folks are doing, right? Different cause, but it's the same objective, to change society, to change policy, get people thinking in ways they ought to think, to make the necessary changes. He looks around and all he finds are Quakers. And they were sort of written off by most of British society in the 1780s and 90s as, well, they're a little odd. Quaker men have this odd habit, kind of annoying to a lot of British people. They don't take their hats off in the presence of nobility, if they can get away with it, because to them that offended a higher authority. But they had spoken out, a number of them, against slavery. So in May of 1787, this is several years after Clarkson wrote this essay and was finally now galvanized into doing something about it, he calls together around a table in a print shop in downtown London 11 other people, mostly Quakers, so there's 12 people around a table, and guess what they do? They started the world's first think tank. They did. First think tank. It was called the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And it was a think tank because the whole purpose was ultimately to change policy by starting first to educate the people, to bring them a message that wasn't being carried to them by anyone else. Well, that's a pretty tall order in 1787. You're going to change the British Empire? You're going to get them to abolish slavery? Lots of places are doing it. Scholars and teachers and preachers and intellectuals are all, for the most part, in support of this, or they're indifferent to it. Or they write things like, well, it's just the lot of some to be enslaved by others. It's always been that way. So here's Clarkson and 11 oddballs who are going to change the course of British and world history. And he's barely out of college. at this point. The first thing they do is they take his prize-winning essay and translate it from Latin back into English, publish it and distribute it, start publishing other things. Over the next 20 years, until they actually, in 1807, secure by an act of Parliament the abolition of the trade in slaves, Thomas Clarkson will ride on horseback 35,000 miles around Britain, gathering signatures on petitions. If you saw the movie Amazing Grace, you remember the moment when Wilberforce, on the floor of the Parliament, unrolls that massive petition over objections by the other side, because this is never done. You know, you don't bring the rabble into the Parliament with petitions and signatures. That's, we're above that. Well, it was Clarkson who rustled up those signatures, hundreds of thousands of them from all over Britain. Clarkson and his lieutenants, people he recruited. He was one of the people, as depicted in the film, in fact, who recruited Wilberforce to be their man in Parliament, to introduce the bill every year to end the trade in slaves. Clarkson is the guy who, if you recall from maybe your high school history text, you ever see that famous sketch of what a slave ship looked like? A lot of little black lines. And if you look really close, you can see those are people, and they're chained one to another in horrific conditions. That was Clarkson's idea. He said, we've got to make this real to people. We've got to show them graphically. Here's what we're talking about. Living people packed like sardines, chained one to another in these awful conditions, going across the Atlantic Ocean away from their homes and families. He goes to Josiah Wedgwood. How many of you have Wedgwood pottery in your home? Okay, the guy who founded that company, which I think is now out of business, Josiah Wedgwood, was recruited early to join the anti-slavery cause. Clarkson goes to him and says, can you come up with an image that can become sort of we would say logo, I don't know if they had that term then, but a kind of a symbol of our movement. And it's Wedgwood that comes up with that famous sketch that shows up on plates and mugs, and I don't think they had T-shirts then, but if they had, it would have been on those too, of a kneeling black man in chains, looking upward, and with his hands in prayer. It says around the perimeter of wherever this image appeared, am I not a man and a brother? Well, that helped to galvanize people. It pricked their conscience. It made them think about this institution of slavery. So through education, through championing the cause, at great risk to himself, he was beaten almost to within an inch of his life once by angry slave ship crew members, either Bristol or Portsmouth. Enduring many threats, Clarkson and his merry band of agitators go to work on the British conscience. They actually begin to gain ground the first few years that Wilberforce is introducing the bill in Parliament, and then something happens in 1793 that turns their fortunes against them, at least for a time, and that is war with France. This is the start of a very long series of wars, and you know who appears late in that decade and will last for another 16 years fighting the war with Britain, and that is Napoleon Bonaparte. But in 1793, Britain goes to war, and now what do the opponents of the anti-slavery movement say in Parliament? They say, look at these people, Wilberforce and Clarkson. They're traitors. They want to do away with British involvement in the very lucrative slave trade. All that will do is hand the business over to the French, our enemies. These guys are traitors. So you might think, boy, facing those kinds of threats and intimidation, that they might have said, let's lie low for a while. They kept up the fight. And even in the midst of the war, which wouldn't end until 1815, they will prevail. And as shown in that wonderful movie, Amazing Grace, that great moment arrives. The movie doesn't tell you this, but it happened at 4 a.m., but it was in February of 1807, 20 years after Clarkson formed the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And year after year of defeat in Parliament, the bill comes up once again. And in February of 1807, the bill to abolish the trade in slaves passes overwhelmingly. It's one of the pivotal moments in the history of human liberty, and depicted so beautifully in that film, Amazing Grace. Well, after 20 years of all that struggle, putting aside his career plans, you'd think maybe he would have said, okay, I want to go back to what I was planning to do and a more peaceful life. He and Wilberforce resolved that very day that to renew their commitment to the big objective, which wasn't just ending the trade in slaves, but to end slavery itself. Guess how many more years it will take before they achieve that? All they do in 1807 is get an abolition in the trade in slavery. No new slavery. But it leaves enslaved the many who had been rounded up before. How many more years do you think it'll take them before they get that big objective? 26 more years. So this is a 46-year battle. That's a pretty big chunk of one's life, isn't it? It's in 1833 when Parliament, and Wilberforce, incidentally, this is one of the last votes he cast, or one of the, not last votes he cast, one of the last votes he saw cast because he died 3 days after this. It was in 1833 that Parliament voted to abolish slavery itself throughout the British Empire. And Britain goes from being a slave-holding, trading nation to now being the leading anti-slavery crusading power on the planet. Largely because of the efforts of people like Wilberforce and Clarkson, who started out when things were rather lonely. There's a great book that came out a few years ago called Bury the Chains by Adam Hochschild, and he tells the story of this movement, and Clarkson figures so very prominently in the book. He talks about how the night before the bill was to take effect and all the slaves within the British Empire were to be freed, in island after island throughout the West Indies, these people who were enslaved went to the highest point on those islands. Why? Because they wanted to be there the next morning when the sun came up, because for them it was a new day in more ways than one. Now in his 70s, having achieved the prime objective, Clarkson didn't sit on his fanny and do nothing. He forms organizations to help transition people from slavery to freedom. When he dies in 1846, at the age of 86, London saw one of the biggest funerals it had seen in many years. Hochschild, in his book, talks about an interesting thing that happened at Clarkson's funeral. He was the last of the 12 that had formed around that table in 1787 to still be alive in 1846. But the sons and the grandsons of some of those Quakers who he had enlisted were there at the funeral. And the Quaker men did something that they almost never did. They took off their hats. Here was truly a hero for humanity. Ellen Gibson Wilson, one of Clarkson's biographers, writes, kind of sums him up so well when she says, Thomas Clarkson, 1760 to 1846, a man who gave his life to liberate people he never met from lands he never saw. That's a pretty good epitaph, isn't it? This man set about to change the conscience of a nation, and he did it. Power of one. The second person I want to tell you about is a woman. How many of you know who Fanny Crosby was? Oh, a few more. Yeah, she's a little better known. Fanny Crosby. What a remarkable woman. You know, not even 100 years ago, she was probably the best known woman and the most revered woman in America. She died in 1915 at the age of 95, born in 1820. And yet here it is, not even a century since she passed away and was the most revered and best known woman in America. There really aren't many people, especially young people, who've ever heard her name. But there are some pretty remarkable things about Fanny Crosby that explain why she was looked upon as almost a saint, as a role model, someone who had enormous influence for good because of the way she lived her life. I'll tell you some of those things. You know, she was the first woman to address the United States Congress. Right there, that tells you, wow, she must have done something pretty important, right? How many of you have met one American president, either when he was in office or maybe afterwards? How many of you met two? How many of you met three or more? Okay, wouldn't you all agree anybody who would meet, say, five, would that be a pretty remarkable achievement, right? Fanny Crosby, as best we know, probably holds the record for having met more American presidents, either when they were in office or afterwards, than any other American living or dead. How many do you think she met? 21. 21. It's almost half of the 44 who have served as president. That tells you something. Wow, she did something. Why was she so sought after? She's known for, among other things, her remarkable charitable work. In the 1870s, New York City was hit with a terrible cholera epidemic. Thousands fled the city to escape cholera. She stayed behind, ministered and nursed many of the sick, contracting cholera herself, but later recovering from it. She lived a life of that kind of charitable activity, sometimes at great risk to herself. She's also the person who holds the record for having written the lyrics to more tunes, I think all of them were hymns, than any other person in human history. How many hymns do you think she wrote? Almost 9,000. Some of them are on any given Sunday today, almost a century after she passed away. There might be hundreds of thousands, maybe several million Americans who are singing Fanny Crosby hymns. Blessed Assurance, To God Be the Glory. Many of you know those. Those are two of her better known ones. Okay, but is that all she's known for? Is that what made her so sought after? The most remarkable thing about Fanny Crosby is that she never had any recollection of having seen a thing. From the age of 6 months, she was completely blind. And yet she developed a phenomenal memory. You know how sometimes if you lose one sense, your other senses are sharpened? That was the case with Fanny. But she was so quick to share these things and was such a humble person. She would never boast about any ability that she had. And she often actually said regarding her handicap that she thanked God that she had the handicap that she did, because if she hadn't, there would have been so many things she wouldn't have seen. How ironic. She didn't see a thing, but she felt she saw so much. What a remarkable woman. When she testified to Congress, or spoke as the first woman to talk to Congress, her message wasn't, hey, I've got a problem here, where's my check? Her message was, it's incumbent upon all of us, regardless of our gifts or lack thereof, to use what we have as best we can for the improvement of the lives of all of us. Don't sit back and whine. Do whatever you can. Be the best example, the best model you can be. What a message. That's why presidents, famous people and not so famous, wanted to touch Fanny Crosby, wanted to come within her presence. She was so revered by so many. What a model of solid character. Isn't it sad that she's not talked about today very much? Wouldn't you think that the high school history texts in talking about great Americans would include the first woman to address the Congress, the number one record hymn writer in world history? But of course, you know, most of those texts are written from a politically correct standpoint, and you can't talk about Fanny Crosby without talking about her faith. And we can't do that. That might be harmful to somebody. So we forget people like Fanny Crosby. And I sometimes wonder, how are we going to generate great inspirations in the future if we forget so many of them from our own past? Fanny Crosby was a great woman, irrespective of what your faith may be, and a great example, great role model, worth learning more about. The third part, how much time do we have left, incidentally? Okay, I'll kind of do this one quickly, but this one's near and dear to my heart because I know him and have visited him half a dozen times in the last 8 years. As I mentioned, he just turned 103 on the 19th of May, still sharp. In fact, I have taken groups of students over to London to little history tours, and I always arrange to take this gentleman to lunch and have the students meet him, and I have the students watch the documentary about him before we go, so they know what he did and why it's such a privilege to meet him. His name is Sir, he's been knighted by the Queen, Sir Nicholas Winton, W-I-N-T-O-N. Does anybody know that name? Okay, if you Google him, you'll see a ton of stuff about him. Nicholas Winton. The last time I took a group of students was in February of 11. I called him in January. He would have been 101 and a half. And I said, Nicky, I'm coming over next month with 3 students. Are you going to be around? And here's what he said at 101. He said, well, I'm going to be in Prague, the Czech Republic, for part of the month. What date is it? And I'll try to be here. At that age. Well, here's his remarkable story. In 1938, Nicky Winton was a 29-year-old stockbroker in London. And 1938, if you remember your history, was a pretty pivotal year. It was the last full year of peace before the outbreak of the Second World War. It was early in that year that Hitler annexed Austria. And then he made moves on Czechoslovakia, prompting the famous Munich Conference in September of 38, where Britain and France said, okay, if you leave it at that, we'll let you have the so-called Sudetenland, the perimeter of Czechoslovakia. And what did Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain fly back to London and say when he, yeah, we have peace in our time, as he waved that scrap of paper that Hitler had signed. And so in the fall of 38, a lot of naive people, including the leadership of Britain and many governments, think we've averted war. We've pacified Hitler. We've given him what he wanted. He won't go any further. And so there's a kind of a sigh of relief in a lot of places. But Nicky Winton knew that things were going to get worse, that Hitler would not be pacified. But nonetheless, what could one person do in that kind of environment? So he plans, in spite of the world plunging towards chaos, he decides he's going to go to Switzerland for a vacation at Christmas time, 1938. A friend of his who worked in the British Embassy in Prague, Czechoslovakia, gets a hold of him ahead of time and says, Nicky, don't go to Switzerland. Come here to Prague instead. There's something I've got to show you. He prevails on Nicky. Nicky goes to Prague. What he wants him to, his friend wants him to see, he gives him a tour of, are refugee camps in and around Prague, full of hundreds and hundreds of Jewish families who have fled, in some cases Germany, other cases Poland, other cases the Sudetenland that Hitler has just occupied within their own country, and now have come to the capital. They're in these freezing conditions in these makeshift camps at the start of winter, 38, 39. And what does he find as he goes through these camps? Desperate parents who can't get any government anywhere to give them a visa to get in, who are desperate to at least get their children out of harm's way, who know that Hitler's not going to stop and that they're in great danger, and they're pleading with him as a perfect stranger, can you take our children? Could that not help but instill in you an incredible, I don't know how you describe it, to see parents, loving parents, begging you as a perfect stranger to take their children out of harm's way? Now, he could have said, oh, gee, I sympathize, but hey, I've got a vacation planned. Or he could have said, what can one person do? I mean, this is too much of a tall order. What can I do? But he's a man of character. And he had such a feeling for what he saw, wanted to try to do something. Immediately, he starts sending telegrams, writing letters to governments around the world, saying, we've got thousands of children in harm's way in and around Prague. If I can get them out, will you allow them to enter your country? How many countries do you think responded in the affirmative? Only 2. Even the United States, the Roosevelt administration, said, nope, nothing we can do. The official policy is peace in our time. You know, we let you do this, it's kind of an admission that Hitler's a bad guy. We just signed, or we didn't sign in the US, but our friends have signed a pact that says he's not going to go any further. Only 2 countries, Sweden and Britain, his own Britain. But even the British Home Office says, if you want to bring them here, we think this is going to blow over. We don't want to get stuck with the bill to send them back, so we'll let them come in, but you have to find the foster families, and you have to put $3,000 in today's money on deposit per child, so that, you know, if we have to ship them back, we can take care of that. So Nicky goes to work. He gets a group of volunteers together. He ends up over several months organizing 9 rail transports of children. And in a documentary that's been done, they have footage from Prague Station, now Wilson Station, in Prague, of these parents tearfully. In one case, there's a mother who gives up her daughter and then takes her back and then decides again to give her up. It goes on several times like this, because they didn't know if they'd ever see each other again. And in fact, almost none of those children who did get out will ever see their parents again. He organizes 9 rail transports. The first 8 of them involve 669 children. He got them out of Prague, got them mostly to Britain, a few to Sweden, and had a foster family in place for every one of them. And the only reason he couldn't talk about this for 50 years, not until 1988, is because of what happened to the 9th and the largest of the transports. He had 250-some kids in the rail cars, ready to go, foster families spoken for, already planning to accept them in Britain on the 1st of September, 1939. When war broke out, the Nazis stopped all transports. Not a single one of those 250 kids survived. Not a one. Nicky joins the RAF, where he serves for 6 years, later meets the woman who becomes his wife, never even tells her about this. It's just kind of forgotten. He has no interest in keeping in touch with the children. He placed them when he could while the clock was ticking, and that's what he did. They didn't know. Most of them, almost none of them, I don't know that any of them actually knew who it was who organized the effort that saved their lives. In 1988, his wife is going through the attic, and she finds this box with a scrapbook in it, with hundreds of names, visa material, pictures of kids, and what have you. And she says, "What's this?" And he finally tells his wife for the first time. The word gets around. Mrs. Maxwell, I forget her first name, but the wife of the media mogul, she knew Mrs. Winton, and she said, "We got to tell the world about this. Those kids are going to want to know, those who are still alive, that the man who saved their life is still around." So there's a television show, or was at that time in Britain, called That's Life, or we had something in the US like that, like It's Your Life or something, where they focus on somebody, tell his or her story, and reunite them with long-lost loved ones or something. Well, in the documentary that's been done about him, there's a clip from that 1989 show. They called Nicky into the studio at a TV station to film a live half-hour show in which the hostess was going to tell the Winton story. She has the scrapbook, and unbeknownst to Nicky, they had gone around to try to find as many of those children, now in their 60s typically, or in that range, to be there at the show. All he knows is they're going to tell the story that he kept so quiet for so many years. They put him in the front row. The hostess of the TV show is explaining how 669 children were saved. And then she says, "Might there be in this audience someone who might have been saved by Nicky Winton 50 years ago? If so, please stand." And I still get goosebumps when I think of it or watch it. Everybody in the audience stands. They had found several hundred of the Winton children, and he turns around and is reunited with them, and that's 1989. It's all these years later at 103, and he's still going strong. You say to him, Nicky, you're such a hero, and he's the first to say, don't call me that, I did what I could. He's such a humble guy, which only endears him to you all the more. He's regarded in Britain as Britain's Schindler. I've seen headlines, stories about him, and he doesn't like that. He doesn't like the fame. Here's a guy who could have made a lot of money, and you couldn't have faulted him if he'd written a book about what he did. But he just couldn't do it, and which underscores the fact that he did what he did, not for fame, not for fortune, but because it was the right thing to do, because he didn't give up, because he wouldn't take no for an answer, because he thought, if there's anything I can do, it's worth doing. Do you know that the number of people who either are or were, for a time, some have passed on, alive because of what he did, that is, the children themselves that he saved and their children and their grandchildren, you know what that total is? It's more than 5,000 people who either are still alive or were, until recently, alive because of what he did. He's been knighted by the Queen. Some other quickly remarkable things about him is at the age of 96, as a fundraiser for some charities that he had started decades before, he became the world's oldest man to fly in an ultralight aircraft. And he's done it every 2 years since to keep up his record. He's really remarkable guy. But what's the lesson of that? There's one guy against the world, against almost every government in the world who was either part of the problem or didn't want to have anything to do with the solution. And yet he took initiative, and what was the result? Not just a change in policy, that's noble and lofty enough. He saved lives by the thousands. What a remarkable achievement, and I'm convinced to this day that he's 103 and sharp and in good health because that's God's way of saying, well done, thy good and faithful servant. I would hope that all of us would not only never give up no matter what the odds, recognizing that history is full of examples of people who changed things against remarkable, overwhelming odds. I hope that you'll all decide, if you haven't already, that at some point when it comes time that you check out, you want to be in a position looking back on your life to say something like what the Apostle Paul said on the eve of his martyrdom, when he said, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. In other words, I may not have solved every problem, but I did what I could. When I knew what was right, I committed myself to it, and I did all that I could. I tried not to be a part of the problem. I tried to be part of the solution. I never failed to take an opportunity to persuade others of the right path. I served as a good example myself, because that's the way people learn most of the time, by example, not necessarily by what they read. That's the position we want to put each of us in at some point. And that's why I like to tell young audiences, of students in particular, it's never too soon to work on your character. And you'll never regret it. If you work on it from day one, you will have a life of accomplishment that you'll never regret and be able to look back and say, wow, I made a difference. I wasn't like so many who've lived on this planet who didn't leave a mark, or if they left one, it wasn't a good one. I was one of the ones that made a difference because I chose to. One person can change lives, can change history, can change the world. Never underestimate what one person can accomplish. Thank you for being so.
Well, that was great, Larry. I think that maybe there are some questions. We have some time for questions if anyone has one. And I don't know if there are any or not, but there is a microphone if you want to. And because we're tape recording it, we really need you to use the microphone. And I'm just going to start out with one question that I have that I was thinking about when Larry was speaking. And that's the fact that if I listen to the examples that you gave, and I think about these folks out here and how busy I know they are with their own lives, with their own families, with whatever. Were those folks not busy? Because that's a lot of dedication. How did that work?
Well, the three I talked about clearly are extraordinary, and nobody would expect someone to give up their career or their families on behalf of a cause. But the message here is that there are causes worth committing a lot of time and attention and resources to. And once you've taken care of the essentials in your personal life, that is such things as your relationship with your Creator, the care of your family and loved ones, don't forget there's a world around you that needs fixing. And there's much that we can do to affect change for the better if we'll commit our time to it. So the three I gave you are extraordinary. And you might think, well, I can't do anything quite that big. But remember, they faced obstacles that are at least as big as we face, if not bigger, and that yet they prevailed. Can you imagine? Let's apply it to healthcare. Think of the men at Valley Forge, the winter of 1777, 78. How do you think they would react if you walked through that camp with those freezing conditions and said to those men, well, I know you got it bad, but hey, we just got a health care bill. They would say, what? Well, get off your duff and go to work. The message is do whatever you can for the causes that you know to be right. It's never too little.
Is there another question? Maggie's got a mic there. I am going to take that.
Hey Larry, if we were on a cruise ship tonight and we were right outside of Honolulu and time would have been unlimited tonight, who would have been 4 and 5 on your list? And again, thank you for coming tonight. And Twyla, thank you for bringing Larry in as a speaker.
Thank you. Well, at least I can give you number 4. This guy is my favorite president. And any guesses?
George Washington.
Nope, although he's up there. No, Grover Cleveland. I'll just summarize real quick for you. I have a personal reason. I've always admired him since college days because he believed in all the right things. Limited government, low taxes, free trade and free enterprise, sound money. He was against the welfare state, all balanced budgets, everything, all the good, right things. And I had written a bunch of essays about him since my college days. And in May of 1995, I was reading the Almanac of American Politics and it had a lot of trivia about every president. And in every case it had, among other things, who their children were when they were born, their birth dates, death dates, and where they lived. And under Grover Cleveland, it had the 5 Cleveland children. And the last one, it said 1903, no death date, Tamworth, New Hampshire. His name was Francis, named for his mother. And I thought, this was 1995, he was 92, and I thought, could he still be living? He'd be the oldest living child of an American president, and the one I most admire. So I called information for Tamworth, New Hampshire, and got a number for Francis Cleveland, called it. A man answered. I said, is this Francis Cleveland? He said, yes, it is. And I said, the son of the former president? He said, that's me. And I said, well, I'm coming up to New York this summer twice, in July and August. I'd like to rent a car and come up to New Hampshire to see you on one of those trips. Could I do that? Because I've been writing about your dad since my college days. I have a $1,000 bill photographed, blown up, and framed in my dining room because your dad's picture's on it. Stuff like that. And here's what he said at 92. He said, well, 65 years ago, I started a performing arts company here in Tamworth called the Barnstormers. I'm still directing it, and I'm completely booked in July. Can you come in August? So a colleague and I spent an evening with Francis Cleveland. And I remember at one point I said, Francis, you have to understand what a thrill this is for me. I'm talking to a man whose father, not grandfather, but whose father was first elected president of the United States 111 years ago. In 1884, I'm talking to his kid in 1995. I said, how could that be? Well, see, Grover was the first president to marry while he was president in the White House. He was 49 as the president, and his bride was 21. And the fifth and final child, Francis, was born 6 years after he left the White House in 1903 when Grover was 67 years of age. So that's how, anyway, when I said that to Francis, he said, that's nothing. Cleveland's marry late and they have children late. And my grandfather, Grover's dad, was a baby when Thomas Jefferson was in the White House. What a young country. But anyway, and he couldn't remember much about his dad because he was 5 when Grover died in '08. But his mother, because she was so much younger, she lived to 1947. So he told stories that his mother had passed on about life in the White House. And one of them was how the White House during the latter part of the first term had not been wired for telephone very long. And not many people in America yet had telephones. But on weekends, when he said Mother would often be out and about around town, and the White House staff was all gone, and Grover was the only one in the White House, and if you happened to have a phone and called the White House and said, may I speak to the president, you'd get a voice saying, speaking, because he was answering the phone on Saturdays. But I love Grover Cleveland because he was known as honest to a fault. That was what propelled his career. So it was such a meteoric career. In 1880, he was just a lawyer in Buffalo, New York, who had served one term some years before as sheriff of Erie County, New York. That's it. 4 years later, he'll be elected president of the United States. And in between, he'll be elected mayor of Buffalo and governor of the state of New York. And honesty was his policy. He was just honest as the day is long. Forthright. He would tell you what he believed. His attitude was so refreshing. It was, hey, I don't have to be in public office. There are other things I can do, so I'm going to tell you where I stand. You make the choice. I'll be happy whatever you decide. He believed in the Constitution. He repeatedly said, it's not my job to rewrite it, but to uphold it. So he didn't try to stretch it to confess to things that our founders never intended. He was faithful to the Constitution, and he believed in all the right things. So that's a condensed version of my Grover Cleveland talk. Number 5 would probably be William Ewart Gladstone, my favorite British Prime Minister. Holds the record for, he has 61 years in Parliament, most times as Prime Minister, 4 times. He's an example of one of the few politicians that got better with age. Because, so many, they start out, they're good, but they get corrupted. He only got better. And he was able to boast by his 4th prime ministry when he was in his 80s that Britain's economy was far freer than when he started. It had 12 tariffs instead of 1,200, that its budget was balanced, that the scope of the state had been shrunk. He was a believer in small government and lower taxes. He was Britain's Grover Cleveland. And I just so admire him. So he'd be number 5. Thank you.
Harry Borgendale, my question is, so how do you restore the character of our country?
How do you restore the character? Well, first of all, I want to underscore how you're not going to get it done by any act of any legislative body. Government at any level does not teach character. It cannot. It will not teach liberty. Or any of its organs will not teach liberty. That has to come from the hearts and the minds of people. It has to start in the home. And most people learn and are affected by what? By example. That's why the first duty of every person is to be the best example they can be for their families and for those whose sphere of influence they come within. That's the first thing. Don't try to reform the world until you fix yourself. And you ever notice how so many people who want to reform the world haven't even started on themselves yet? They're a mess, but they think they got a plan for the rest of us. Be the best example you can be first in your own life, and you'll be amazed at how much influence you can have. And then I think reading, recommending biographies of great men and women, especially to young people, is a great way to instill these virtues. So young people come up saying, wow, I want to be like a David Livingston or a Margaret Thatcher or Fanny Crosby or a Grover Cleveland. Give them good examples, not only from your life, but from the pages of history as well. That's why heroes, good ones, are so important. And then cultivate character, reward it. Punish bad character, especially if it shows up in public office. How many times do we reward bad character in public office? I mean, I remember I lived in Michigan for 33 years. Remember Charles Diggs, corrupt congressman to the core, shaking down his own staff? And he gets reelected. He's not there now, but he got reelected. I remember thinking, that constituency is saying to the country, character doesn't matter to us. As long as the guy brings home the bacon, we don't care how corrupt he is. No society can survive if that's the way the great majority of people think. So that's just it's a never-ending battle, but it starts with being the best example you can be yourself.
Is there another question? I think there might be just one more question that we could do. Back there.
This is not a question, it's just a statement about something Larry said. That you mentioned when you started having this time of questioning that most of us are not going to take the actions of the people that you mentioned, where they basically left everything, because the first question was really a good question. These people were really busy, so how did they do all of this? Yeah. And they dropped what they were doing and spent their life doing it. See, that's kind of the example Twyla is. Absolutely. To me. One person. And I think of how you have affected our state, the country, and really have a healthcare debate opened up to, with ideas and information that most of us never would have ever come anywhere close to getting. So I would just like to thank you for being that one person, because I know you were in the healthcare profession before. You left everything and you took that giant leap of faith. So I'd just like to thank you.
Best example.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.